Live from Washington, this is BBC News. 4 Israelis previously being held hostage by Hamas are released as the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire comes to a close. And in exchange, hundreds of Palestinians are freed by Israel, prompting scenes of jubilant crowds in the occupied West Bank. And here in the US, President Donald Trump says he'll meet with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to sign a very big agreement on mineral resources. Hello, I'm Rishka Gupta and welcome to the programme where we begin with Israel and Hamas moving forward with their final exchange of hostages and prisoners tonight as part of the first phase of the ceasefire deal. First, Hamas handed over the bodies of 4 hostages to the Red Cross at Kerem Shalom crossing. From there, they will be taken to their families in Israel. The handover of the bodies was held in private instead of the widely broadcast public ceremonies for previous exchanges, which Israel has condemned. In exchange, Israel is releasing more than 600 Palestinian prisoners. These pictures here came through in the last hour or so, showing people arriving in the occupied West Bank after being released from the Ofer prison. Buses have taken some to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, while others are due to be released in occupied East Jerusalem. This all comes after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delayed the release of Palestinian prisoners on Saturday, alleging Hamas violated the ceasefire agreement. Hamas accused Israel of deliberately disrupting the ceasefire deal, the first phase of which ends on Saturday. President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is travelling to the region to advance talks on a second phase of the truce. Our Middle East regional editor, Sebastian Usher, sent this update from Jerusalem.
It looks like the big setback that there was at the very end of this first phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has been overcome, that the last remaining 4 dead hostages who were to be returned as part of that first phase of the deal are being returned, and the more than 600 Palestinian prisoners whose release was suspended last Saturday, that they too are to be released. So that is a movement forward, but there's still huge question marks over what comes next. This was set out as a 3-phase deal. When phase 1 ends, phase 2 should begin. Phase 2 would see the release of all the remaining Israeli hostages, alive or dead. It would see Israeli troops withdraw fully from Gaza, and it would see an end to the current hostilities there. But there are still big differences between Hamas and Israel over this. The Israeli government essentially does not want Hamas to play any role in Gaza anymore, that it must be disarmed entirely, and that it must not have any political role, any say in Gaza's future. That's something that Hamas has so far rejected. Those are the issues that negotiators have to get to grips with. And the fact that they haven't even started those discussions doesn't raise hopes that this next phase will be able to go smoothly. We've already had problems, we've had bumps all along the road of the first phase. I think that is likely to get even more difficult as the more intractable issues have to be faced up to as the ceasefire hopefully continues.
Elsewhere, thousands of Israelis gathered along a funeral procession route in southern Israel to mourn 3 members of the Bibas family who were killed in captivity in Gaza. Freed hostage and father Yadin Bibas said his final goodbye to his wife Shiri Bibas and 2 young sons who were killed by Hamas. Family members spoke to their love for Shiri and her sons and called on Netanyahu to save the remaining hostages.
I want to ask your forgiveness on behalf of our leadership and military who weren't there for you that day and who took so long to bring you back to your homeland.
Many people asked for your forgiveness, and Yarden's and ours, but the blame is not on them. This disaster should not have happened. You should not have been taken, and you should have returned alive.
I've been speaking with Javed Ali, Associate Professor at the Gerald Ford School for Public Policy at the University of Michigan, who told me what's next for the ceasefire.
We are now entering into another very difficult part of this ceasefire deal with phase 2. Remarkably, phase 1 was able to achieve its objectives, even though there were moments that we all know where it seemed like things were going to collapse. And I suspect that it's going to be even a tougher period into phase 2 if we get to phase 2. with the negotiating teams that are trying to work on that right now. But as the previous segment also indicated, still a lot of questions about the contours of phase two, whether both sides will get everything that they want, and what will happen if the talks collapse in the coming days.
And Trump posted that AI video. It showed Gaza as a beach resort, and he's already said that he wants to make it the Riviera of the Middle East. That hasn't been taken well from Arab leaders who are against the idea, which would displace over 2 million Palestinians. Is Trump's plan realistic?
Well, President Trump, when he communicated that, or communicated his plans for what he believes should happen to the Gaza Strip, that was met with a lot of criticism and controversy. But if the video from last night is any indication, it would appear that he is still sticking to some version of that plan, maybe not to the degree as captured in the video, but President Trump has not yet said he is willing to walk away from this idea of a completely rebuilt Gaza Strip and the fate of all the Palestinians who live in that right now. So that seems to be such another important topic that is part of this broader set of issues in the region that are even beyond the ceasefire deal. What is the future of the Gaza Strip, and who will be in control of it, and how long will it take for whatever the vision or the future of that plan is to come into play?
And the US's position, that has been quite confusing. Originally, he put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu to get to phase one of the deal. Then recently he has said that he is fine with whatever Israel decides to do, whether it goes to phase two or whether it resumes the war. So how is that going to impact getting to phase two? And what do you make of that?
Well, there seem to be a number of competing dynamics that are affecting the Israeli calculus on this, and perhaps even on the Hamas side. But on the Israeli side, as we've heard, Prime Minister Netanyahu has vowed to destroy the military organization of Hamas, and that part of the campaign has probably not been completely realized. He's also facing a lot of internal pressure from within his coalition for folks who actually want to see Israel step back from the ceasefire deal and enter into a resumption of military operations against Hamas. And again, what are the forces on Prime Minister Netanyahu's side that are preventing him from going in that direction, even if he thinks that the U.S. would be okay with that? And so there's a lot yet that isn't clear in terms of what Israel's next steps are. Is it fight, or is it continue to negotiate, or perhaps a little bit of both at the same time?
Meanwhile, the White House says the AI video posted by President Trump of a redeveloped Gaza featuring golden Trump statues and the Israeli Prime Minister, but no Palestinians, was not created by anyone at the White House. In a statement to our U.S. media partner CBS, Deputy Press Secretary Anna Kelly said President Trump is a visionary, and his plan to have the U.S. involved in Gaza's rebuilding will allow for Palestinians to resettle in new, beautiful communities while improving conditions in the region for generations to come. And the video was met with disbelief among many critics. Hamas said Trump's ideas go against the culture and interests of Palestinians. President Trump says Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky will visit Washington on Friday to sign an agreement on sharing Kyiv's mineral resources with the United States. At a press conference in Kyiv on Wednesday, Mr. Zelensky insisted the deal is preliminary and that he won't sign anything without the U.S. guaranteeing his country's security in the event of a ceasefire with Russia. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is also due to meet with President Trump at the White House this week. He'll be in Washington on Thursday. Sir Keir has reiterated his call for a U.S. security guarantee in Ukraine. But Mr. Trump says the U.S. would not make those guarantees as part of the latest deal. The BBC's analysis editor Ross Atkins looks at what we know about the agreement.
A deal on Ukraine's minerals had seemed a long way off. Not now.
We're going to be signing an agreement, which will be a very big agreement.
Last week, Donald Trump called President Zelensky a dictator, suggested Ukraine had started the war, and reportedly demanded 50% of Ukraine's mineral deposits. Mr. Zelensky said no to that, said, "I cannot sell our country," and claimed President Trump was living in a disinformation space created by Russia. it wasn't going well. But now Donald Trump talks of a deal. President Zelensky calls it a framework, and details are scarce. The Ukrainian Prime Minister says an investment fund will be set up for his country's reconstruction, that it will be managed by both countries on equal terms, and that the fund will receive 50% of future proceeds from state-owned mineral resources. One issue, though, appears unresolved. President Zelensky says, "I wanted to have a sentence on security guarantees for Ukraine, and it's important that it's there." He goes on, "If we don't get security guarantees, we won't have a ceasefire. Nothing will work." Multiple reports suggest the deal, in its current form, is not clear on this issue. And this all comes in a week when the US twice voted with Russia on UN resolutions about the war, and when Friedrich Merz, who will be Germany's new leader, said that independence from the US is an absolute priority for Europe. America's ongoing commitment to Ukraine's security is still not certain. But Ukraine has substantial mineral deposits, even if making the most of them is not straightforward. Some are in territory controlled by Russia, and Ukraine's mining infrastructure has been badly damaged by the war. Nevertheless, Ukraine has something the US would like. Exactly what it gets in return remains an open question.
Around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News. Let's look at some other stories making news. Manchester police believe they have found the body of Rania Ali-Aid, who was killed by her husband in 2013. Police say new information on the case led them to find human remains in North Yorkshire that they strongly suspect are Miss Ali-Aid. Her husband, Ahmed Al-Khatib, is serving a life sentence for what was a planned honour killing. The UK government's independent climate advisors say that within 15 years, 4 in 5 cars should be electric and half of homes should have heat pumps. By law, the UK must reach net zero, no longer adding to the total amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by 2050. And television and radio presenter Henry Kelly has died at the age of 78. Born in Ireland, Mr. Kelly started out as a journalist before turning to a career in entertainment. He's best known for his hosting of the programmes Game for a Laugh and Going for Gold. In a statement, Mr. Kelly's family said he died peacefully after a period of ill health. You're live with BBC News. US President Donald Trump convened the first meeting of his cabinet on Wednesday, but the most prominent attendee, besides the president himself, was his senior advisor, none other than tech billionaire Elon Musk, someone who isn't a member of the cabinet and whose exact title and role remains unclear. Mr. Musk said the US will go bankrupt if he fails in his role at the Department of Government Efficiency, where he's been given unprecedented powers to cut federal programs.
We simply cannot sustain as a country $2 trillion deficits. The interest rates, just the interest on the national debt, now exceeds the Defense Department spending. We spend a lot on the Defense Department, but we're spending over $1 trillion on interest. If this continues, the country will become de facto bankrupt. It's not an optional thing, it is an essential thing.
Mr. Musk and President Trump were asked about what's in store for more than 1 million federal workers who didn't respond to an email sent Saturday that ordered them to list 5 things they have accomplished at work in the last week. At the time, Mr. Musk added on social media that failure to respond would be taken as their resignation. But several government departments told their workers not to send an answer. Mr. Trump said he wasn't sure what would happen to those workers who didn't write back.
You know, I wouldn't say that we're thrilled about it. You know, they haven't responded. Now, maybe they don't exist. Maybe we're paying people that don't exist. Don't forget, we just got here. This group just got here. But those people are on the bubble, as they say. You know, maybe they're going to be gone. Maybe they're not around. Maybe they have other jobs. Maybe they moved and they're not where they're supposed to be. A lot of things could have happened.
And our North America correspondent Naomi Iqbal sent this report from the White House.
If there is any tension between Elon Musk and President Trump, it certainly didn't show. Not only was Mr. Musk obviously at the cabinet meeting, but he dominated. And if there was any tension between Mr. Musk and the cabinet secretary sat at the table, that also didn't show, despite the fact that the president did ask them if they had a problem with Mr. Musk. The tech billionaire took lots of questions from reporters, answering their questions about the work that he's doing with Doge to reduce the federal workforce. Now, Mr. Musk doesn't actually have an office here at the White House. He went to the executive office building in front of me, and it's reported that Mr. Trump's Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, had made sure of that. Now, it's been a very busy week for President Trump. As we know, earlier this week, he hosted the French President Emmanuel Macron, the first European leader to see Mr. Trump here since his re-election. He will be meeting President Zelensky later this week on Friday to start the negotiation on that minerals deal. But before then, the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, will be at the White House, and he comes bearing gifts. Mr. Trump is a transactional president, and Keir Starmer has announced that he will be increasing UK defence spending, which will be music to Mr. Trump's ears. He's always wanted NATO countries to pull their financial weight, but the issue of Ukraine security and Europe's security will of course be very much on the agenda.
The energy giant BP has announced that it is cutting its renewable energy investments and focusing instead on revenue from increasing oil and gas production. Its rival Shell is also doing the same. Simon Jack reports.
5 years ago, BP, with great fanfare and glossy videos, set out an ambitious plan to become greener, scaling back on oil and gas, ramping up renewables, a strategy for the future from which it said there was no turning back. Today, the company unveiled a radical change in direction. With the chief executive telling investors the world had changed since then.
Our optimism for a fast transition was misplaced, and we went too far, too fast.
And BP would change with it.
We will invest around $10 billion in oil and gas, 20% more versus previous guidance, enabling us to build more higher returning major projects and increase exploration.
So how exactly has the BP strategy changed over time? Well, a 2020 pledge to cut oil and gas production by 40% by 2030 was downgraded 2 years ago to 25%. And as you heard today, that was abandoned completely with a pledge to start increasing fossil fuel production from this year. So why the change? Well, look at this. Since those pledges were made 5 years ago, BP shareholders have seen a total return of 36%. Not bad, but compare that to this. 82% for Shell and a whopping 160% for US-based ExxonMobil. Both of those have a much smaller renewables focus. The truth is, oil and gas is more profitable than renewables. The UK government has vetoed new oil and gas exploration in UK waters, but 90% of BP's production is international, and other governments feel very differently.
We will drill, baby, drill.
Not all shareholders agree with the new strategy, and dismayed climate groups insist BP and other oil companies are being short-sighted.
Obviously, it's worrying that some of the biggest and best capitalized companies in the world have chosen not to be participants in the low-carbon transition. But the reality is that low-carbon transition is coming. The oil industry is depriving itself of probably the best business opportunity of the rest of this century.
BP announced today it's looking to offload its solar power division, and it's already moved its offshore wind business into a joint venture. The company insists it still aims to be net zero by 2050, but the distance to that target seems further rather than nearer today. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Joining me live is Lisa Sachs, Director of Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, Columbia Climate School. So Lisa, welcome. This is quite the turnaround for BP, but the big question is, why are they doing this now? Is it just about the share price and them not being able to compete with their rivals, or how much of this is influenced by Trump's drill baby drill comments?
Yeah, well, I don't have any inside info, but I imagine that BP is responding to the decisive shift in policy signals in the U.S. and, by the way, in Europe also, but especially in the U.S. that have indicated that we need all types of energy and a lot of it, and have taken the brakes off fossil fuel production. So I think the policy signals are quite decisive for commercial decision making.
But its rivals are doing similar things, like Shell and also the Norwegian company Equinor. They've scaled back their plans to invest in green energy. So do you think more companies are going to follow suit?
I think we should not put too much credit into the pledges that companies make. in the absence of real capital allocations and in the absence of a real policy framework set forth by the governments. These retractions are taking place in the context of a real vacuum in leadership from governments. Governments are responsible for setting the policy agenda and for creating the regulatory framework that makes investments in renewables affordable and profitable, and that makes investments in fossil fuels less profitable. And they haven't done that. So I do think that we will expect to see more investments in fossil fuels as a result. I would note, though, that I agree with the prior commentator that this is very short-sighted and that a lot of these investments in fossil fuels are necessarily going to be stranded in the future. And to protect these investments, what we're going to see is BP, Shell, and all these companies putting more and more effort into lobbying against climate action because they'll want to protect these long-term investments. It's arrogant, it's dangerous, and it's gambling against our future. And they're going to be up against quite a fight.
So, Lisa, speaking of our future, what is this going to do overall to those efforts to tackle climate change?
Yeah, I mean, the other crazy part about this timing is that this past month, one of my colleagues at Columbia, Jim Hansen, a wonderful climate scientist, published evidence that global warming is accelerating even faster than estimated. He gives reasons because of the response to greenhouse gases and to the reduced aerosols in the air, and that we are going dangerously close to irreversible tipping points. So this is more fossil fuel production is absolutely dangerous, very dangerous from a climate perspective, and it's quite arrogant. This is this is mainly happening in the U.S. and the West. Other parts of the world are betting much more aggressively on the energy transition, which is taking shape. So the rest of the world is plowing forward with renewable energy investments and a greener future. But for sure, the U.S. and Europe that are lagging behind are putting us in great danger.
So, Lisa, who then could be taking on that leadership when we look globally? If we're seeing the U.S. and Western sort of scaling back, is it China?
I definitely think China is taking over. I mean, they have been actually for a while investing quite steadily and aggressively in the energy transition, both in clean energy infrastructure, not only in China, but all over the world in EVs. They are doing this not only they're doing it for an energy security perspective, from an economic perspective, from a diplomatic perspective, from a investing in the future perspective. So I absolutely think we've already ceded leadership to China. And the question is now whether the EU and the US will even try to keep up.
And you mentioned earlier that you don't think these fossil fuel companies can be trusted to deliver on the clean energy transition on their own. And you mentioned that government really needs to step in with policy. What kind of policy action are you looking for?
First of all, absolutely. I think we should just understand that in general in the context of net zero pledges. Net zero pledges, first of all, count for very little, but more importantly, they depend on a policy framework that makes those pledges possible and credible. Ultimately, companies are chasing profits and assessing risk and so on. So policies have to roll back subsidies for fossil fuels. They have to put in place also to make permitting and grid capacity easier to bring renewable energy online faster. Emission standards throughout the sector, make grid infrastructure for electrifying vehicles. These are all critical public policies, regulations, public investments that are absolutely essential for accelerating the transition. We saw some of it under Biden, not enough. But these are absolutely the types of policy measures that are critical to bringing the private sector along in the investments that will then ultimately be profitable for the private sector, but that they won't do on their own.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Lisa Sachs of Columbia Climate School.
Thank you so much.
Now, actress Michelle Trachtenberg, who rose to fame in the 1990s, has died at the age of 39. Police say her death is not being treated as suspicious and that they found her unconscious and unresponsive after responding to an emergency call on Wednesday morning. The US actress was best known for her roles in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Gossip Girl. She started acting at the age of 3 on a Nickelodeon series, The Adventures of Pete and Pete. Archaeologists in Pompeii are revealing their latest discovery. Large, almost life-sized paintings known as frescoes that show the god of wine and fertility, Dionysus. They appear to depict initiation rituals for followers of Dionysus. The discovery comes from a dig that began 2 years ago and has so far uncovered more than 50 rooms in the ancient Roman city, which was destroyed by a volcanic eruption almost 2,000 years ago. And let us remind you of our top story and take you live to Ramallah, where a little earlier, hundreds of Palestinian prisoners have been greeted after being freed by Israel as part of the final exchange of the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal. Others are due to be released in Jerusalem. In return, Hamas has released the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages in Gaza who are being identified by Israeli officials here in Tel Aviv. The release of 600 Palestinians was delayed on Saturday after Israel alleged Hamas ceasefire violations. The handover of the bodies was held in private instead of the widely broadcast public ceremonies for previous exchanges. And you can keep up to date with all of the latest stories on our website, bbc.com/news, or on the app. Thank you so much for watching with us tonight. Please do stay with us here on BBC News. Goodbye.